The knock came just before dusk. Jacob hadn't had visitors in years, not since the fire, not since the grave. He opened the door and found a woman holding a shivering boy wrapped in an old blanket, her husband behind her, too thin to look dangerous, but proud enough not to beg. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she just looked him in the eyes, the kind of look a man doesn't forget. He could have shut the door, told them to try the next town, another ranch, but instead, he stepped aside. He thought he was offering a night's shelter, just one meal, one warm floor. He didn't know he was opening the door to a family. He didn't know the boy would later stand between him and a bullet. He didn't know that this knock, the one he almost ignored, would save his soul. Dust rose beneath the old mare's hooves as Jacob crossed the back pasture, the sun lowering like a burnt coin behind the cottonwoods. His world had shrunk over the years, from the laughter of friends and clatter of Sunday barn doors to the quiet creak of a rocking chair and the wind pressing against the wooden siding of a house meant for more than one. His ranch, once thriving, had become a place of silence, of chores done without urgency and meals eaten without company. Since the fire and what followed, he had closed the front gate to the world and never looked back. The cattle were fewer now, the barn was half empty. He only fixed the things that mattered, fences that kept wolves out, wells that kept water in, the rest he let fall to time. He didn't mind the isolation anymore. It suited a man with too many ghosts. The sky turned lavender as he unsaddled the horse, steam rising off her back into the cooling evening air. He rubbed her neck with a practiced hand and spoke to her softly, though no words were needed. She was the only creature he trusted, and even she seemed to understand the weight of the silence that filled the valley. He was just finishing the last loop of rope in the tack room when he heard it, a sound so foreign it took a moment to register. 3 knocks. Sharp, hesitant. Not the wind, not the animals. Human. At first he thought he imagined it. Then it came again, steadier this time. He walked toward the house slowly, every footstep muffled by dirt and memory. No one came to his ranch, not in years. He didn't get mail, didn't attend town meetings, didn't trade at the market. Folks had long since stopped trying, which meant whoever knocked now either didn't know who he was or didn't care. The porch creaked beneath his boots as he reached for the doorknob. His hand paused. The last time someone knocked on this door, it had been the sheriff with trembling lips and a letter soaked in ash. He opened it anyway. Standing there were 3 figures, a woman, lean, with deep shadows under her eyes, but her spine straight as a fence post. A man, thin and gaunt, cheeks hollow, hat pressed low as if shame might be hidden behind its brim. And a boy, no older than 10, clinging to the woman's coat, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better decades. They didn't speak, just stood. The woman met his eyes and something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, not of the face, but of the pain. The man beside her looked like he wanted to speak but didn't know how. It didn't matter. Jacob saw enough. He could have said no, sent them away with a bucket of water, and pointed them toward town. It would have been easier, cleaner, the kind of decision he had made before, when the weight of someone else's suffering felt too much to carry. But tonight, something shifted. Maybe it was the boy's bare feet on splintered wood. Maybe it was the way the woman didn't plead. Maybe it was because he remembered once being young and hungry, standing on a different porch, with a different hope. He stepped aside. The house took them in without protest. The floor creaked as they entered, the smell of stew lingering from a meal eaten alone hours earlier. The woman set the boy down on a chair near the hearth and pulled off his shoes, revealing blistered skin and torn socks. The man hesitated before removing his hat, eyes scanning the space as if unsure whether he'd walked into kindness or a trap. Jacob moved quietly, setting another log on the fire, ladling stew into tin bowls, pouring water from the jug. No one spoke. Words weren't necessary. Hunger spoke louder.
Exhaustion spoke deeper. The night deepened around them. The oil lamp flickered, casting shadows against the wall. 4 figures in a house built for 5. Jacob watched as the boy leaned into his mother's side and fell asleep mid-bite. The woman's hand rested on his hair, not moving, not trembling, just holding. The man's head bowed over the bowl, and for a moment Jacob wasn't sure if he was praying or hiding tears. When the fire burned low and the dishes had been scraped clean, he pulled out an old mattress from the storage room, one that hadn't been used since. He didn't speak as he set it near the fire, just handed the man a wool blanket and turned away. That night, he didn't sleep, lay in bed listening to the wind scratch against the windows and the occasional soft cough from the other room. The house felt different, fuller, alive somehow. He stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time someone had breathed in this house besides himself. He couldn't, and yet he didn't regret opening the door. He didn't know their names, didn't know their story, didn't ask. But something told him this wasn't the end of the knock. It was the beginning.
The following morning, the frost clung to the edges of the window pane like lace, delicate and sharp. Jacob stood by the sink, nursing a tin mug of bitter coffee, his eyes drifting toward the barn. The sun was only a faint blush behind the hills, not yet strong enough to warm the soil or chase the mist from the grass. He wasn't used to rising with noise in the house. The subtle stirrings of other bodies, footsteps too light to be his, soft murmurs, the creak of old floorboards under different weight disrupted the silence that had become his companion for so long. And yet, he didn't find it unwelcome. Through the curtain, he saw the boy, barefoot again despite the cold, stepping carefully around the porch, chasing something only he could see, a moth maybe, or a shadow. The woman was hanging damp blankets by the fence post, her sleeves rolled high despite the morning chill. The man was nowhere in sight, but Jacob guessed he was already in the barn. The latch had been moved and the shovel leaned differently against the wall, signs no one else would have noticed, but Jacob did. He stepped outside with deliberate slowness, the screen door groaning in protest. The cold bit into his neck. As he passed the woman, she offered him a glance and a brief nod. Not seeking approval, not asking permission, just acknowledging a shared space. She moved like someone used to labor, someone who had worked long before hunger came knocking. Jacob noticed her hands were rough, blistered in the places rope and buckets wear you down. Not recent wounds, but healed over history. The barn smelled richer than usual. Fresh hay had been added to the stalls, tools had been rearranged, and one of the feed bins had been patched with wire and a scrap of tin. Jacob found the man near the water trough, sleeves rolled, arms deep in the mechanism that hadn't pumped right in weeks. He didn't say anything, just handed over a wrench when the man reached blindly behind. Side by side, they worked in silence, metal against metal, breath visible in the cold morning air. It wasn't camaraderie, not yet, but it was no longer discomfort. By midday, the smell of something warm drifted from the house, beans maybe, and cornbread. Jacob sat on the porch, boots off, a wool blanket across his knees. The boy had fallen asleep curled like a cat against the rail post, his lips parted, a trail of drool glistening on his cheek. Jacob studied the curve of the child's shoulder and the way his fingers twitched even in sleep. For a moment, just a flicker, he saw another boy, years younger, chasing chickens in the same yard. Heard laughter, high-pitched and bright, echoing off the barn walls. But when he blinked, it was gone, just the stranger's son in its place, breathing slow and even. He found himself watching them more that day, how the woman stirred the pot with small efficient movements, how the man always stood between her and the door as if shielding her without thought, how the child would wake and immediately look for his mother's face before anything else. They fit together, broken in places, yes, but still held fast by something invisible. Something Jacob hadn't seen in a long time. It unsettled him, and softened him too. The day wore on slowly. Chores were done with more hands than usual, and the house, once filled only with wind and memory, began to feel like it was breathing again. Jacob didn't speak much, but neither did they. He wasn't ready for stories or names.
But he let the man repair the gate near the horses and didn't correct the woman when she swept out the storage shed. Let the boy sit beside him at supper, silently chewing with eyes too large for his face. That night, as he locked up the barn and scanned the stars, he realized something strange. The ache in his chest that used to sharpen at sunset had dulled, not vanished, but eased, like a splinter slowly working its way out. Inside, the woman had patched a hole in the curtain with a square of cloth from her own dress. The man had fixed the creaky hinge on the pantry door. The boy had drawn something on the dusty back window with his finger. A sun, he thought, or maybe a wheel. Jacob stood in the hallway longer than usual that night, listening to them settle into sleep. The floor didn't groan under loneliness anymore. It carried the weight of lives in motion. He returned to his room and sat at the edge of the bed, reached for the photograph he kept in the drawer, the one he hadn't touched in months. A face smiled up at him, younger, lighter. Her eyes were familiar, still alive in the house in ways he hadn't dared to believe. Jacob set the photo back carefully and turned off the lamp. The dark felt warmer now, not so hollow. And outside, the wind carried not silence, but breath. 3 new ones, woven into his own.
The morning mist still lingered across the field like a silver veil when Jacob stepped out onto the porch with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. The boy, barefoot as always, had taken to following him around the farm like a shadow. He didn't speak, but his presence was steady, like the steady ticking of a clock in a room that had long been silent. Jacob had grown used to the boy's questions, delivered in wide eyes and small gestures, pointing at the chickens, tracing the worn shape of an old rifle leaning in the corner, touching the rough bark of the sycamore near the well. Each day, the boy grew a little bolder. He had begun helping Jacob carry tools, fetch water, and even feed the horses. His silence wasn't from fear anymore. Jacob saw that. It was something else. A kind of reverence, maybe. A quiet understanding between 2 souls who didn't speak much, but felt too deeply. Inside the house, the woman had transformed the kitchen into a place Jacob barely recognized. The old checkered curtain had been washed and rehung. A woven mat now covered the scuffed floor near the hearth. She had found scraps of cloth in the attic and stitched them into something colorful and soft. A blanket now draped over the armchair no one had sat in for years. It was a quiet resurrection of a space that had forgotten how to live. He never asked her to do it. She never asked for permission. But Jacob let it happen. The man, whose name Jacob had still not asked, had become a fixture in the fields. He worked beside Jacob, repairing fences, reinforcing the barn walls before the summer storms came, and clearing brush from the far pasture. There was strength in his shoulders and precision in his hands. He didn't waste movements, didn't talk unless needed. They worked as men who understood the land and each other without needing to name what they were building together. But peace never settled long in Jacob's life without a warning. Late in the afternoon, as the sun stretched long shadows across the fields, a rider passed by the road beyond the fence. Jacob saw the dust first, the shimmer of a horse cresting the ridge. It wasn't unusual. Travelers passed often, but this one slowed as he reached the turn, his eyes scanning the house, the barn, the clothesline that now held the woman's washing. He tipped his hat as he passed, but his gaze lingered too long. That evening, Jacob rode into town under the excuse of needing nails and grain. He hitched his horse outside the general store and overheard 2 men near the saloon muttering about a family gone missing up north. One said the sheriff had sent riders to question ranchers downriver. Another mentioned something darker, debts unpaid, a body found near a stream. Jacob kept his head down, bought his supplies, and returned home with a heavier silence than usual. At dinner, the boy nestled against his side. The woman served stew that tasted of thyme and something sweet he couldn't name. Her hands trembled slightly when she passed him the ladle. Jacob noticed, but said nothing. The man looked out the window more than he ate, his jaw tight, knuckles white around his spoon. That night,
Jacob didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, the stars bright and endless above. The house behind him breathed slow and deep. He could hear them shifting in sleep. He thought of the writer, the saloon talk, and he realized something strange. He cared. Not just about the danger, about them, their survival, their peace. He was no longer a man waiting for time to pass. He was a man who had taken something into his home that now had roots. And with roots came the threat of being torn up. In the barn the next morning, Jacob built a false wall behind the hay bales, just in case. He stacked crates over it and scattered straw across the floor to hide any trace. The man helped without asking questions. The woman packed a small bundle and tucked it behind the stove. The boy looked between them all with knowing eyes, but said nothing. Outside, the wind had changed. He could feel it, like breath held too long. They didn't speak of danger, but they all felt it pressing in like weather. And Jacob knew the next chapter would not be written in silence.
The knock on the door came just after midday, sharp and deliberate, as though the hand behind it was used to authority. Jacob stood in the middle of the room, heart already quickening. The boy had been napping in the corner with a tattered stuffed dog the woman had stitched from old cloth. The woman stood near the stove, her back suddenly straight, her breath caught mid-motion. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. Jacob gave her the faintest nod, and she moved swiftly, scooping up the child and slipping silently through the back door, disappearing into the line of trees that led to the barn. Jacob opened the door slowly. Two men stood outside. One wore a crisp jacket and polished boots, out of place on a working ranch. The other had a bandolier slung across his chest and a long rifle strapped to his back. Dust caked their boots, and the horses behind them were lathered with sweat. They looked like they'd ridden hard and had no patience left. The man in the jacket tipped his hat, more out of habit than politeness. He introduced himself as someone from downstate, representing a concern that had been missing some property. His voice was slick, the kind that smiled while sharpening a knife behind its back. He said they were looking for a family, man, woman, and boy, who'd skipped out on debts sowed to the wrong sort of people. Nothing criminal, he said, just unfinished business. But it had gotten ugly. A body found up near the pines, a farm torched. They had reason to believe the family was somewhere out here. Jacob kept his expression unreadable, hands resting loosely at his sides. He said he hadn't seen anyone. Lived alone, always had, too far out for visitors. He didn't keep a dog anymore, and the cattle weren't loud enough to rouse attention. Just him, the wind, and the chores. The second man didn't speak. He stepped past Jacob and glanced around the porch, eyes sharp, body still. He sniffed the air like a predator, noticed the fresh wood stacked by the door, saw the worn path toward the barn. His fingers flexed near the butt of his revolver, not drawing, just reminding everyone he had one. They asked to look around. Jacob stepped aside, letting them peer into the main room. He didn't stop them. That would raise questions. But he also didn't invite them in. He moved slowly, keeping himself between the men in the hall leading toward the back. The rifle over the hearth remained untouched, but it hung like a silent threat. Out near the barn, behind crates of straw and the false wall Jacob had built, the woman held the boy against her chest. Her hand covered his mouth gently, not to silence him, but to calm his breath. The boy's eyes were wide, not with panic, but with understanding, as if he had known this moment would come. Inside the house, the men lingered. One picked up a tin cup, sniffed it, set it down. The other squinted at Jacob with the eyes of someone who had seen a lot of liars and wasn't sure what to make of the silence. But eventually they left, not satisfied, not defeated, just delayed. As they mounted their horses, the man in the jacket looked back once and said if Jacob saw anything, even a shadow, he should send word. There were rewards involved, he added.
Men like Jacob didn't live rich. A few dollars could fix a fence or buy a new horse. He smiled again, but there was venom behind the teeth. Jacob didn't answer, just shut the door slowly. When the wind had swallowed their dust trail, Jacob walked out to the barn. The sun was dipping behind the ridge, painting the sky with bruised light. The woman stepped out from hiding, her face pale but dry. The boy followed her, holding tight to her hand. She looked at Jacob as if to ask whether it was over. Not the danger, but the test. Whether he still wanted them here. Jacob didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night he sat on the porch with the rifle in his lap again. The land had gone quiet, even the cicadas hesitant in their song. But something had changed. This wasn't a man waiting for trouble. This was a man standing between it and something worth protecting. The fire he thought had gone out long ago, the one that used to drive him to build, to fight, to care, was flickering again. Weak, maybe, but alive.
Night fell heavy and fast, as if the sky had been torn open and spilled all its ink at once. The moon hid behind a jagged wall of clouds, and the wind carried no song, only the dry rustle of distant branches, a warning that something was coming. Jacob had been uneasy all day. After the visit, he kept the rifle closer, the lanterns lower, and the boy and the woman inside the house. The cattle had been restless, refusing to settle, their senses sharper than any man's. Animals knew what people denied. Something dark was near. It happened not long after midnight. A sound, faint but deliberate, the clink of metal against wood, the snort of a horse being held still. Jacob was already on the move, boots silent on the floorboards, rifle in hand, heart locked in a slow, heavy rhythm. He checked the windows, saw shadows where shadows didn't belong. 2 men this time. No hat tips, no questions, just cold intent. Then came the crash. The back door splintered inward with the blow of a boot, and the woman screamed. Jacob spun, firing a shot into the dark, missing, but sending one of the men diving for cover. Glass shattered. Another shot answered. This one caught Jacob in the shoulder, slamming him against the wall. Pain bloomed, hot and immediate, but he didn't drop the gun. The boy had been asleep on a cot by the kitchen. The scream woke him, but he didn't cry. He didn't freeze. He ran. Not out the door, not away, but toward the sound. Toward the man who had given him food, a roof, a bed with a blanket. Toward the man who had never asked for anything in return but had stood between him and the fear. The boy didn't understand courage, but he knew what love was. And when the second man raised a pistol, aiming for Jacob's back, the boy leapt. The shot still rang out, but it hit something else, something smaller, softer. Jacob turned in time to see the boy fall, a flicker of movement like a leaf tossed by the wind. The woman screamed again, but this one came from somewhere deeper, not her throat, but her soul. She lunged forward, grabbing a fallen lamp, hurling it at the man with all the fury she had carried for years. It burst into flames, oil licking the floorboards, catching on the curtains. The fire drove the intruders back, not because it threatened them, but because it was wild, out of control, and because in that moment she looked like something they couldn't kill. They fled. The barn doors banged open, hooves pounding into the darkness. Jacob crawled across the floor, blood trailing behind him, until he reached the boy. He pressed his hand to the small chest, searching for movement, for a breath, for a sound. And then, a gasp. Faint, but real. The boy was alive, hurt, but alive. The bullet had grazed his ribs, tearing flesh, not life. Jacob's hands trembled as he lifted him, holding him close, whispering nothing, just breathing. The woman knelt beside them, pressing rags to the wound, rocking, praying without words. The fire crackled around them, heat rising, smoke curling toward the ceiling beams, but they didn't move. Not yet. Later, when the flames had been tamed and the boy rested with his head on Jacob's chest, the woman looked at the man who had given them shelter. And Jacob, bloodied, burned, exhausted, looked back. No one said what had happened, but something had changed. Again. The boy had saved him, not with strength or a weapon, but with the purest kind of loyalty, the kind that only grows when you water it with kindness. That night, the house didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a home.
The sun rose quietly in the days that followed, casting its usual light over a landscape that somehow felt different. The old wooden house stood scarred and scorched, but not broken. Smoke stains marked the window frames, bullet holes punctured the kitchen wall, and the back door leaned awkwardly on a single hinge. But inside, where it mattered, something had shifted, like the beams of the house had been replaced by something stronger than wood. Jacob's shoulder was wrapped in layers of linen in quiet pain. He moved slowly, favoring his right side, but refused to lie still. He had always worked alone, healed alone, endured alone. But now there were two more chairs at the table, one holding a boy with a bandaged chest and fever-warmed cheeks, the other a woman who had once said little and now said even less, but with eyes that stayed on Jacob longer than before. Silence had grown thick between them, but no longer uncomfortable. It was shared, like the heat from a single fire. Word had spread faster than either of them expected. Maybe it was the gunshots. Maybe it was the smoke that had curled up into the sky like a black flag waving for miles. Or maybe the land simply had a way of carrying stories, whispering them through the cottonwood trees and across the dirt roads, until every man and woman for miles around knew what had happened on Jacob's ranch. They came one by one. A neighbor who hadn't spoken more than a nod in 5 years brought nails and new hinges. An old widow from across the river came with a basket of cornbread and honey. A man from town, rough around the edges, once quick with judgment, handed over 2 rolls of tar paper without saying a word. And Jacob, unused to the presence of others, didn't refuse. He couldn't. Not now. The tide had turned, not because he asked for it, but because the world had taken notice of something rare, selflessness without witness. The boy slept long hours, waking only for spoonfuls of broth or a gentle touch. When he finally opened his eyes for more than a moment, they no longer darted with fear. He saw Jacob differently now, not as a stranger with a rifle, but as someone worth fighting for. He didn't need to say it. The way his hand found Jacob's when he was near, that was enough. The woman tended to them both. She cleaned and stitched, cooked and watched the horizon, but even she began to soften. One evening, she left a carved wooden animal, small, simple, made from a piece of kindling, beside Jacob's plate. A wolf, he thought, though it might have been a dog. She never said, but he kept it. Life didn't return to normal. It became something better. Slower, perhaps, but warmer. The fields grew tall again, the barn got a new coat of red, and the porch, once a place of solitude, now held 3 chairs, often filled as the sun dipped low behind the hills. One afternoon, Jacob stood at the edge of his land overlooking the wheat swaying in the breeze. The woman stood beside him, the boy just behind. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because somehow, without asking, he had been given something far more valuable than safety or peace. He had been given belonging, and it had all started with an open door.